Thank you for listening. This is my book talk on Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown. My name is Kelsey Tice, and this is for ING 589. To start, here's some background information about Atlas of the Heart, mapping meaningful connection and the language of human connection. If we want to find the way back to ourselves and one another, we need language and the grounded confidence to both tell our stories and be stewards of the stories that we hear. This is the framework for meaningful connection. This is from Brown's work 2021. Here's some background information about the author and the book. Brene Brown is a 5-time #1 New York Times best-selling author. She's done extensive research into experiences that make us who we are. She thinks that we should accurately name an experience to give us the power of understanding, meaning, and choice. The book is organized into 3 main parts. There's an introduction where she talks about her research methods and gives some information about the book. And then she goes into different sections about the places that we go in different scenarios. And this is basically sort of like an encyclopedia of different emotions and how we react to those emotions, how they affect us. And then finally, the book ends with a cultivating meaningful connection section. Most of the book is the places we go section. That part is most of the content of the book. The next 2 slides are a sort of roadmap of the places we go when section of the book, the major part of the book. The first section is about where we go when things are uncertain or too much, and it goes through these emotions here. The second part is when we compare. The third part is when things don't go as planned. And then the fourth part is when it's beyond us. The fifth part is things that aren't what they seem. And the sixth part is places we go when we're hurting. The 7th section is places we go with others, and it covers these emotions. The 8th section is places we go when we fall short. The 9th is when we search for connection. The 10th is when the heart is open. The 11th is places we go when life is good. The 12th is when we feel wronged. And the 13th section is places we go to self-assess. Let's start with a brief introduction to the introduction for Atlas of the Heart, mapping meaningful connection and the language of human connection. In the introduction, Brene says, in my experience working with clients, the ability to name this emotion or experience is essential to being able to process it in a productive and healing manner. In order to recognize, name, and make sense of our feelings and experiences, we must do the following. First of all, we have to understand how and why emotions show up. Secondly, we have to think about how our families and communities influence our beliefs in relation to feelings, thoughts, and behavior. Thirdly, examine our go-to behaviors. And finally, think about what brought about these behaviors. For the first section on categories of emotions, she talks about places we go when things are uncertain or too much. And the major emotions that she covers are stress, overwhelm, anxiety, worry, avoidance, excitement, dread, fear, and vulnerability. I won't cover all of these because it would end up being a very long presentation, but I will go over the parts that I found to be most useful. Places we go when things are uncertain or too much. One of the parts that I found really helpful is when she talks about the difference between being stressed versus being overwhelmed. She says that being overwhelmed is an extreme level of stress. It is when we are unable to function because of the level of stress. Another important thing that I found in this section is that being vulnerable is not being weak. It is actually a prerequisite for being a daring leader. I found it really interesting that Brene talked about her own life a lot in the book, and she discussed when she was a server and how they used the terms being in the weeds and being blown. And this is a quote from that section. Stressed is being in the weeds, overwhelmed is being blown. These are phrases that they would use in the service industry. So in the weeds would just mean, that it's kind of a stressful situation. There's a lot of people needing a lot of things. Whereas when someone says that they are blown, it means that they need a break. And so people would take over for them so that they could go and take a 10 to 15-minute break. This is another quote from page 15. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's our greatest measure of courage. The next section about categories of emotions is places we go when we compare. This includes comparison, admiration, reverence, envy, jealousy, and resentment. Places we go when we compare. Brene informs us that we are hardwired to compare. She thinks it's important that we choose connection over comparison. She gives a scenario of how when she's swimming, which she often does, she finds herself being competitive with the people who are swimming in the lanes next to her. And she has learned that it is better to say something to herself like, have a good swim, instead of comparing herself to the people who are swimming next to her. And she finds that that often helps her to focus on her own swimming rather than going to that place of comparison. Another interesting part of this section is about jealousy. She says that jealousy can often lead to more dire consequences like drinking problems, violence, etc. She says that also in this section, it's important to be careful about bonding with people over other people's failures, even if it's somebody you really dislike and you have some really strong reasons for disliking that person. What this does is this can build counterfeit connections, meaning that it's not real connections with people when we're bonding over other people's failure. This is something that I unfortunately have found in my own life that I have done sometimes with people, and so it's something that I know that I've found that I need to work on as well. Comparison is the crush of conformity from one side and competition from the other. It's trying to simultaneously fit in and stand out. Comparison says, be like everyone else, but better. Envy occurs when we want something that another person has. Jealousy is when we fear losing a relationship or a valued part of a relationship that we already have. And she talks about how we often use these words in the wrong way. And so language is important. And so it's important to know when we're talking about envy versus jealousy. This is a really powerful quote. Nothing that celebrates the humiliation or pain of another person builds lasting connection. The next section is places we go when things don't go as planned, and it includes boredom, disappointment, expectations, regret, discouragement, resignation, and frustration. Places we go when things don't go as planned. A recent study shows that boring tasks and activities can actually give our imaginations room to play and grow. So boredom is actually a good thing. When we develop expectations, we imagine how things are going to be and look. We develop a sort of movie in our heads. Our expectations are often dependent on things totally out of our control. Some expectations are unexamined and unexpressed, and some are examined and expressed. But either way, they are our expectations and can often lead to disappointment. This is a quote that I love from the book. As researcher and writer Sherry Turkle says, boredom is your imagination calling to you. And this is something that I try to convince my kids about all the time, that it's good for them to be bored sometimes, that's actually when imagination can really take over and people can be really creative. This slide relates to the last quote. So places we go when things don't go as planned. It's important that we teach kids and model for them how to reality check, communicate, and examine the intentions behind their expectations. So these are some questions that we can ask kids and help them kind of work through these things as they're setting up their expectations. And they're also questions that I think are really helpful for adults as well. What expectations do you have going into this? What do you want to happen and why? What will that mean to you? Do you have a movie in your head? Are you setting goals and expectations that are completely outside of your control? Disappointment is unmet expectations. The more significant the expectations, the more significant the disappointment. When someone shares their hopes and dreams with us, we are witnessing deep courage and vulnerability. Celebrating their successes is easy, but when disappointment happens, it's an incredible opportunity for meaningful connection. The idea of no regrets doesn't mean living with courage. It means living without reflection. To live without regret is to believe we have nothing to learn, no amends to make, and no opportunity to be braver with our lives. This section is about places we go when it's beyond us, and it includes awe, wonder, confusion, curiosity, interest, and surprise. Places we go when it's beyond us. One of the pieces that I found really useful information in this section is to use intriguing information to get people interested so that they become more curious. And this is definitely something we can use as teachers. And this is called priming the pump. So it's important to create opportunities for exposure to new ideas and experiences. Research has found that curiosity is correlated with things like creativity, intelligence, new learning and memory, and good problem solving. Choosing to be curious is choosing to be vulnerable because it requires us to surrender to uncertainty. We have to ask questions, admit to not knowing, risk being told that we shouldn't be asking, and sometimes make discoveries that lead to discomfort. These are places we go when things aren't what they seem, and it includes amusement, bittersweetness, nostalgia, cognitive dissonance, paradox, irony, sarcasm. Places we go when things aren't what they seem. This is a section that I found to be particularly important for teachers. It talked about cognitive dissonance, which is the tension between two ideas, attitudes, beliefs, or opinions that are inconsistent with each other. This dissonance creates mental discomfort, so it's something that we want to try to fix. An example would be somebody saying, smoking can kill me. I smoke 2 packs a day. So when people are dealing with this sort of cognitive dissonance, they have to try to make these two ideas make sense together. So these are some things that they might do. People might reject new information, decrease importance, or avoid it altogether. Brene says it's important to stay curious. Invite new information to the table, sit with it, and hear it out. In these challenging moments of dissonance, we need to stay curious and resist choosing comfort over courage. It's brave to invite new information to the table, to sit with it and hear it out. It's also rare these days. Places we go when we're hurting: anguish, hopelessness, despair, sadness, and grief. This section is probably one of the most difficult ones to read, but very important. Places we go when we are hurting. It's a quote from page 91. Anguish is an almost unbearable and traumatic swirl of shock, incredulity, grief, and powerlessness. Effective trauma work is helping a person to get back their breath, their feelings, their thinking, and even their own bones, and returning to their bodies, because it can feel like in those moments of anguish, like they're not even in their own bodies. Children with high levels of hopefulness have been given opportunities to struggle so that they believe in themselves and their abilities. Brene says that it's important to prepare the child for the path, not the path for the child. So we need to help students to work through difficult struggles rather than just taking the struggle away. After going through all these emotions related to places we go when we're hurt, the chapter ends with some information about hope. Hope is a function of struggle. We develop hope not during the easy or comfortable times, but through adversity and discomfort. Here's a quote that I found really useful. When I'm really scared, worried, overwhelmed, stressed about what's happening and trying to find perspective, I ask myself, will this issue be a big deal in 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 days, 5 months, 5 years? It's all about putting it into perspective. In our saddest moments, we want to be held by and feel connected to someone who has known that same ache, even if what caused it is completely different. We don't want our sadness overlooked or diminished by someone who can't tolerate what we're feeling because they're unwilling or unable to own their own sadness. Places we go with others. This includes compassion, pity, empathy, sympathy, boundaries, and comparative suffering. Places we go with others. If you put yourself in someone else's place, or you might say in someone else's shoes, you actually lose empathic connection. Listen to what the experience was like from that person's perspective. And Brene says you could say something like, feeling invisible is painful. We need to dispel the myth that empathy is walking in someone else's shoes. Rather than walking in your shoes, I need to learn how to listen to the story you tell about what it's like in your shoes and believe you, even when it doesn't match my experiences. This is one of the quotes that I think is really going to stick with me from this book because I think I've really grown up with this idea of walking in someone else's shoes as being a good thing. And I think it is really true what she's saying here about how I have to be able to believe someone even when their experiences don't match my experiences. Places we go when we fall short. Shame, self-compassion, perfectionism, guilt, humiliation, and embarrassment. Places we go when we fall short. This section has a special place in my heart because I find myself sometimes being a perfectionist. In fact, even with this presentation, I find myself trying to make it perfect. Fun little story. When I was recording this slide, I noticed a typo as I was reading it, and rather than just leaving the small little typo that somebody probably wouldn't notice, I went back and fixed it and re-recorded this. Perfectionism isn't self-improvement. In fact, Brene says it is actually trying to earn approval and acceptance. Research shows that perfectionism hinders success and can lead to depression, anxiety, addiction, and life paralysis. Perfectionism is a self-destructive and addictive belief system that fuels this primary thought. If I look perfect, live perfectly, work perfectly, and do everything perfectly, I can avoid or minimize the painful feelings of shame, judgment, and blame. She talks a lot about humiliation. She says that humiliation is the intensely painful feeling that we've been unjustly degraded, ridiculed, or put down. Identity has been demeaned or devalued. Then she goes into talk about some interesting studies related to school shooters. Research shows that many school shooters have described events in their lives that led to extreme humiliation. As a result of these studies, it is so important that we investigate how to foster safety and to be aware of what are we doing in school that allows people to belittle others, leading to humiliation. Something I found really interesting is that she says shame and humiliation are never going to be effective social justice tools. This is a quote from Elie Wiesel. Never allow anyone to be humiliated in your presence. Places we go when we search for connection: belonging, fitting in, connection, disconnection, insecurity, invisibility, loneliness. This is another important chapter for us as teachers. It talks about the difference between belonging versus fitting in. For many kids, belonging or not belonging can feel like life or death. Belonging is a critical component of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. People from marginalized groups often experience two types of dehumanization: stereotyping and invisibility. We have to belong to ourselves as much as we need to belong to others. Any belonging that asks us to betray ourselves is not true belonging. Places we go when the heart is open: love, lovelessness, heartbreak, trust, self-trust, betrayal, defensiveness, flooding, and hurt. Flooding is something that I found interesting in this chapter. It can occur when we are overwhelmed during conflict, making it nearly impossible to have a productive, problem-solving discussion. It's when our survival switch gets turned on and it becomes all about protecting ourselves or attacking the other person. When flooding occurs, this is a good time to take a break from the conversation. Brene says, "I've never once regretted calling a timeout at home or work, not once. I've never experienced a little time and space being a bad thing, but I have plenty of regrets the other way around." Places we go when life is good: joy, happiness, calm, contentment, gratitude, foreboding joy, relief, tranquility. This section is definitely something we can add to our classrooms with our students. There's lots of evidence that gratitude is good for us physically, emotionally, and mentally. Research shows that it is correlated with better sleep, increased creativity, increased decision-making skills, decreased aggression, and decreased blood pressure, among other things. Gratitude is an emotion that reflects our deep appreciation for what we value, what brings meaning to our lives, what makes us feel connected to ourselves and others. Places we go when we feel wronged: anger, contempt, disgust, dehumanization, hate, self-righteousness. Brene says one of the greatest threats to humanity is dehumanization. Dehumanization always starts with language. In the book, she talks a lot about how language matters. It can be a portal to connection, or it can strip people of their humanity. Language matters. It's the raw material of story. It changes how we feel about ourselves and others, and it's a portal to connection. With the same amount of power, language can also be used to strip people of their dignity and humanity. With awareness about how dehumanization works comes the responsibility to call out dangerous language when we recognize it. And finally, places we go to self-assess: pride, hubris, humility. Humility is understanding our contributions in context of the contributions of others, as well as the context of our place in the world. Intellectual humility is our willingness to consider information that doesn't fit our current thinking. Getting it right is more important than needing to prove we are right. This is a quote that I love. "I'm here to get it right, not to be right." The last section of the book is about cultivating meaningful connection. Throughout the book, Brene illustrates her ideas through various illustrations and comics that are very helpful. There are 4 different pages in this section. That's a comic showing cultivating meaningful connection, and I won't read the whole thing, but I do think that it is probably one of the most useful and helpful parts of the book. So it goes through this scenario of, I think, a sort of boss and employee, and the employee is telling the boss about how this meeting didn't feel right, and then there is the narrative tap-out sections where the boss isn't really hearing the person out, and then a section where the boss does cultivate meaningful connection. And it goes through these different scenarios that I think are really useful in helping us to understand how to cultivate meaningful connection and really listen to people and be willing to hear them out for how they experience the situation as opposed to how we think they experience the situation. Here are the third and fourth pages of the comic. And it goes through the same thing of going through the scenario where the employee is trying to tell the boss about what happened, and with the cultivating meaningful connection, the boss is listening, trying to hear the person out, not trying to fix it for them, as opposed to the narrative takeover where the boss is not hearing the person out. This quote is from the end of the book, and I thought it was a really great way for Brene to finish the book. Don't look away, don't look down, don't pretend not to see hurt. Look people in the eye. Even when their pain is overwhelming, and when you're hurting and in pain, find the people who can look you in the eye. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. I feel like I learned so much from reading this book and from putting this presentation together. Here's the citation for the book. Finally, this is a credit slide because I used a slide template.